Hi, I'm Natalie Brennan, and 3 months ago I thought I was protecting my 8-year-old half-sister from a monster disguised as a mother. What I discovered instead was that the monster had been feeding off my family's billion-dollar empire while slowly poisoning everyone in it, including me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The day little Chloe ended up in the emergency room with chemical burns in her throat was the day I realized that sometimes the only way to save someone is to destroy everything they think they know about family. Victoria thought she could play house with my father's money and get away with murder. She was wrong. The trust fund she'd been eyeing for years became the weapon I used to tear down her perfect facade, and now she's the one begging for mercy, while her daughter finally gets the protection she deserves. The morning it all changed started like any other Tuesday in the Brennan household. I was 22, fresh out of Stanford with a business degree I'd never planned to use, living in the guest wing of my father's Malibu estate like some overgrown child who couldn't quite figure out how to leave the nest. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beyond our floor-to-ceiling windows, its gray-blue surface reflecting the same restless energy I felt every time I walked through the marble halls of Cliffside Manor. My father, Richard Brennan, had built this fortress of glass and stone as a monument to his success, but to me it had always felt more like a beautiful prison. Victoria was in the kitchen when I came downstairs that morning, her perfectly highlighted hair swept into an effortless bun that probably took her an hour to achieve. She stood at the granite island in her designer athleisure wear, the kind that costs more than most people's rent, scrolling through her phone while Chloe sat at the breakfast bar, swinging her legs and picking at a bowl of organic granola. My half-sister was a miniature version of her mother, all golden curls and wide blue eyes, but where Victoria's beauty felt calculated and cold, Chloe's was pure sunshine. She was the only good thing to come out of my father's second marriage, and watching her grow up in Victoria's shadow had become my full-time worry. "Morning, sweetie," Victoria said without looking up from her screen, her voice carrying that saccharine tone she used whenever she wanted something. "Your father left early for Singapore. Won't be back until Thursday." This was nothing new. Richard Brennan treated his family like another business acquisition, something to be managed from a distance while he focused on expanding his tech and real estate empire across 3 continents. Victoria had learned to time her worst behavior around his travel schedule, a pattern I'd been documenting for months without really understanding why. Chloe looked up from her breakfast with those enormous eyes that reminded me so much of my own mother, even though we shared no blood. "Natalie, can you take me to school today? Mommy says she has a very important meeting." Victoria's meetings usually involved getting her nails done or having lunch with other wealthy wives who spent their days competing over who could post the most enviable Instagram stories. I'd stopped questioning her priorities years ago, but something about the way she avoided my eyes that morning made my stomach twist with unease. "Of course, princess," I said, ruffling Chloe's curls as I poured myself coffee from the machine that cost more than most people's cars. "We can stop for hot chocolate on the way if you want." Chloe's face lit up like I'd just promised her Disneyland, and Victoria finally glanced up from her phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something sharp in her gaze, something calculating that made me want to grab Chloe and run. The drive to Montessori Academy should have been routine. Chloe chattered about her art project while I navigated the winding coastal roads, half listening to her excitement about painting a family portrait. She was at that age where everything seemed magical, where the worst thing that could happen was forgetting your lunch money or not getting picked for kickball. I envied her innocence even as I worried about how long Victoria would let her keep it. There had been incidents before, small things that could be explained away as accidents or misunderstandings. A playground fall that left suspicious bruises, a severe allergic reaction to shellfish that Victoria claimed to have forgotten about, medications that went missing from Chloe's backpack. Each incident by itself seemed innocent enough, but together they formed a pattern that made my chest tight with anxiety. When I picked Chloe up that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson, her teacher, pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Chloe seemed a bit off today," she said, her voice low enough that my sister couldn't hear from where she was gathering her artwork. She complained of a stomachache during lunch and seemed unusually quiet during story time. Has she been feeling all right at home? I assured her that Chloe had seemed fine that morning, but the knot in my stomach tightened as we drove home. My sister was never quiet, never still, never anything less than a hurricane of energy and joy. The fact that she'd been subdued enough for her teacher to notice felt like a warning bell I couldn't ignore. Victoria was waiting for us in the foyer when we arrived, still in her workout clothes, but with fresh makeup that suggested her meeting had been more social than professional. She swept Chloe into an embrace that looked perfect for the cameras, but felt performative in a way that made my skin crawl. "How was school, baby?" she cooed, smoothing down Chloe's hair with manicured fingers. "Did you miss Mommy?" Chloe nodded against her mother's shoulder, but I noticed how she didn't melt into the hug the way children usually do with their parents. There was a stiffness there, a careful distance that broke my heart. The rest of the afternoon passed in the kind of tense quiet that had become normal in our house. Victoria disappeared into her home office to, quote, handle some business, which usually meant planning her next spa weekend or researching luxury vacation destinations. Chloe and I settled in the media room to watch Moana for what had to be the 100th time, but even her favorite movie couldn't hold her attention. She kept shifting restlessly against the couch cushions, pressing her small hands to her stomach and wincing. When I asked if she was feeling sick, she just shrugged and said her tummy felt weird and burny. Dinner was a formal affair, as it always was when my father was traveling. Victoria insisted on eating in the dining room with the good china, as if maintaining appearances mattered, even when the only audience was an 8-year-old, and her increasingly suspicious older sister. Mrs. Valdez, our housekeeper, had prepared Chloe's favorite meal of chicken strips and sweet potato fries, but my sister barely touched her food. She pushed the pieces around her plate listlessly, occasionally taking small sips from her princess cup, filled with apple juice. Victoria chatted brightly about her day, describing her, quote, productive meetings and her plans for redecorating the guest bathroom, but I barely heard her. All my attention was focused on Chloe, who was getting paler by the minute. It was just after 8 o'clock when everything went wrong. Chloe had finished her bath and was in her pajamas, sitting on her bed while I helped her pick out a book for bedtime reading. She'd been complaining about her stomach again, and I'd suggested we call Dr. Park in the morning if she wasn't feeling better. We'd just settled on The Princess and the Pea when Chloe suddenly doubled over, her face contorting in pain that was far beyond anything a simple stomachache should cause. She tried to speak but only managed a strangled whimper, and when she opened her mouth I could see angry red blisters forming along her tongue and the inside of her cheeks. My training kicked in before panic could take hold. I'd been certified in pediatric first aid since I was 16, a precaution my father had insisted on after my mother's death taught him how quickly life could change. I scooped Chloe into my arms and ran for the stairs, shouting for Victoria as I moved. My sister was making horrible gasping sounds, her small body convulsing with pain, and I could smell something chemical and wrong on her breath. By the time I reached the main floor, Victoria was emerging from her office with an expression of carefully orchestrated concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice pitched perfectly between worry and confusion. "Is she having another allergic reaction?" But I was already grabbing my keys from the hall table. Chloe's weight almost nothing in my arms as adrenaline flooded my system. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no time to figure out what was wrong. I could see the fear in my sister's eyes, could feel her small fingers digging into my shoulders as she fought to breathe normally. Whatever was happening to her was serious, potentially life-threatening, and every second we delayed could make the difference between recovery and permanent damage. The drive to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center passed in a blur of red lights and desperate prayers. Victoria had insisted on coming with us, settling into the passenger seat with her designer purse and a perfectly composed expression that didn't match the gravity of the situation. She spent the entire drive making phone calls, first to my father's assistant to quote, update him on the situation, then to Dr. Park to prepare him for our arrival. I wanted to tell her to shut up, to focus on her daughter who was whimpering in pain in the back seat, but I needed all my concentration for driving through the heavy evening traffic without getting us killed. The emergency room at Cedars was everything you'd expect from a hospital that catered to Hollywood's elite. Clean, efficient, and staffed with medical professionals who were used to handling high-profile patients with discretion. The triage nurse took one look at Chloe and whisked us into a private room, where Dr. Martinez began asking rapid-fire questions about symptoms, medications, and possible exposures. Victoria answered most of them, with the kind of detailed precision that would have impressed me if I hadn't been watching Chloe's face grow paler by the minute. It was Dr. Martinez who first mentioned chemical poisoning. He'd noticed the smell on Chloe's breath, the specific pattern of blistering in her mouth and throat, the way her pupils were dilated despite the bright hospital lights. When he asked about cleaning supplies, household chemicals, anything toxic that might have been left within reach, Victoria's face went through a series of micro-expressions that I cataloged automatically. Surprise, concern, and something else. Something that looked almost like calculation. "Oh my God," she breathed, pressing her hand to her mouth in a gesture of dawning horror. "The cleaning lady was here this morning. Maria, she's usually so careful. But maybe she left something out. You know how children are, always getting into things they shouldn't."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Dr. Martinez nodded grimly and explained that they'd need to pump Chloe's stomach, run blood tests, and monitor her for signs of organ damage. The next few hours would be critical, he said. But if we'd caught it early enough, there was reason to hope for a full recovery. I stayed by Chloe's bedside while they worked, holding her small hand and whispering stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms, where little girls were always safe. Victoria paced the hallway outside, her phone constantly pressed to her ear as she updated friends and family about our terrible accident. I could hear fragments of her conversations through the partially open door, the way she painted herself as the devastated mother dealing with an unthinkable tragedy. Her performance was flawless, but something about the timing felt wrong. Why had Chloe's symptoms started so long after we'd gotten home from school? Why had Victoria been so quick to blame the cleaning lady? And why did she seem more concerned with managing the narrative than comforting her daughter? Dr. Martinez returned around midnight with test results that confirmed our worst fears. Chloe had ingested a significant amount of toilet bowl cleaner, the industrial-strength kind that came with warnings about keeping it away from children and pets. The chemical burns in her throat and stomach were serious but treatable, and while there might be some lasting damage to her vocal cords, she was going to survive. As he explained the treatment plan and discussed the possibility of surgery, I found myself studying Victoria's face for any crack in her perfect mask of maternal concern. It was then that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Victoria's manicure was perfect, as always, but there was a small spot of blue residue under her left thumbnail. Just a tiny speck, barely visible unless you were looking for it, but I recognized that particular shade of blue. It was the same color as the toilet bowl cleaner we kept in the guest bathroom upstairs, the industrial strength formula that Victoria had specifically requested because it worked better than anything else. The same bathroom that Chloe had been using that morning because hers was being deep cleaned by the service Victoria had hired. My hands started shaking as the pieces fell into place. The way Victoria had been so eager to blame the cleaning lady. The way she disappeared into her office for hours while Chloe complained of stomach pain. The way she'd known exactly what to tell the doctors, down to the specific brand of chemical that had poisoned her own daughter. This wasn't an accident. This was something far worse, something so calculated and cruel that my mind struggled to accept it even as the evidence mounted before my eyes. I excused myself to the hallway claiming I needed some air and pulled out my phone with fingers that barely worked. David Chen, my father's attorney and the administrator of the Brennan family trust, answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Natalie, what's wrong?" His voice was sharp with concern, probably because I'd never called him at midnight before, never reached out to him for anything more serious than questions about my allowance or college tuition. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If something happened to me, if I was incapacitated or died, what happens to my inheritance?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his legal mind as he considered the implications of my question. "Under the terms of your grandfather's will, if you die without children before your 25th birthday, Your portion of the trust transfers to any surviving siblings, he said carefully. In this case, that would be Chloe. But Natalie, why are you asking me this? Has something happened? I closed my eyes and leaned against the hospital wall, feeling the weight of realization crushing down on my chest. $800 million. That's what my life was worth to Victoria, what Chloe's life was worth as a backup plan. I wasn't just dealing with a neglectful stepmother, or even an abusive one. I was dealing with someone who saw children as obstacles to overcome, or assets to leverage. I think my stepmother just tried to kill her own daughter, I whispered into the phone, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. And I think I might be next. David's sharp intake of breath confirmed that he understood the gravity of what I was telling him. As my father's oldest friend and the man who'd helped structure our family's financial empire, he knew exactly how much money was at stake and exactly what kind of people that money could attract. Victoria hadn't married my father for love. She'd married him for access to $1 billion trust fund. And now that her own daughter was the only thing standing between her and complete control, even Chloe had become expendable. The next morning brought a parade of specialists, social workers, and investigators who turned our private tragedy into something much more public and serious. Someone, probably Dr. Martinez, had reported the incident to Child Protective Services as a possible case of negligent endangerment. The social worker, Ms. Rodriguez, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd clearly seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable. She interviewed Victoria first, then me, then spoke privately with Chloe once the sedation wore off, and my sister was able to talk again. Victoria's performance during her interview was nothing short of masterful. She wept at all the right moments, expressed the perfect amount of guilt over the accident, and painted herself as a devoted mother who'd simply made a tragic mistake. She'd been reorganizing the cleaning supplies, she claimed, and must have accidentally left the toilet bowl cleaner in Chloe's bathroom where her daughter could reach it. It was a moment of carelessness that would haunt her forever, she said, dabbing at her eyes with tissues that somehow never disturbed her perfectly applied makeup. When it was my turn to speak with Ms. Rodriguez, I found myself faced with an impossible choice. I could share my suspicions about Victoria's involvement, but without concrete proof, I'd simply sound like a jealous stepdaughter, trying to cause trouble for her father's new wife. The blue residue under Victoria's nail was already gone, scrubbed away in the hospital bathroom. The cleaning lady Victoria had blamed was conveniently unavailable for questioning, having returned to El Salvador for a family emergency just hours after Chloe's poisoning. Even my own certainty felt flimsy when I tried to put it into words. Instead, I focused on the pattern of incidents I'd been unconsciously documenting for years. The suspicious bruises that appeared after Victoria's, quote, discipline sessions. The allergic reactions that happened when Victoria was the only adult present. The medications that went missing from Chloe's backpack whenever my father traveled. Ms. Rodriguez listened with the kind of professional neutrality that revealed nothing about her thoughts, but I could see her taking careful notes about dates, times, and witnesses. It was Chloe's interview that changed everything. When Ms. Rodriguez spoke with my sister privately, away from Victoria's watchful presence, a different story emerged. Chloe described how her mother had given her a special drink that morning, something that tasted funny and bad, but that Victoria had insisted she finish because it was, quote, 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 medicine to make her stronger. She talked about other times when Victoria had given her special medicine, usually when my father was traveling and I was at school or out with friends. The social worker's expression grew increasingly grim as Chloe's innocent revelations painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as maternal care. By the time my father returned from Singapore 2 days later, our entire world had shifted on its axis. Richard Brennan was a man who'd built an empire through careful planning and ruthless execution, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility that his own wife might be trying to kill his children. He stood in Chloe's hospital room like a stranger in his own life, his usually confident demeanor cracked by the weight of what he was learning. Victoria clung to his arm and sobbed about the terrible accident, about how the investigators were trying to blame her for something that was clearly just a tragic mistake. I watched my father's face as Ms. Rodriguez explained the preliminary findings of their investigation. How the cleaning supplies had been found in Chloe's bedroom, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental contamination. How the timeline of Chloe's symptoms didn't match accidental ingestion, but rather suggested she'd been given the poison directly. How Victoria's story kept changing in small but significant ways each time she told it. My father was a man who'd made his fortune by reading people, by seeing through facades and identifying opportunities that others missed. As the social worker spoke, I could see him applying that same analytical mind to his wife's behavior. The moment that broke everything happened when Chloe woke up from a nap and saw my father sitting by her bed. Instead of running to him for comfort the way she usually did, she shrank back against the pillows and whispered, "Daddy, I don't want any more special medicine. It makes my tummy hurt really bad." The confusion on my father's face was painful to watch, but Victoria's reaction was even more telling. For just an instant, her mask of concern slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating flash across her features before she could school her expression back to maternal devastation. That night, while Victoria was at home resting and Chloe was stable enough to sleep without constant monitoring, my father and I had the hardest conversation of our lives. We sat in the hospital cafeteria over coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and I told him everything I'd been too afraid or too uncertain to voice before. How Victoria's behavior toward Chloe had always felt wrong to me, too controlling and too focused on appearances rather than genuine care. How the incidents I'd dismissed as accidents now seemed to form a pattern of escalating abuse. How I'd started to worry that I might be the next target, especially as my 25th birthday approached and my access to the trust fund became unconditional. My father listened without interrupting, his face growing more haggard with each revelation. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands as if they might hold answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of a single conversation. "I married her because I thought you and Chloe needed a mother," he said quietly. "After your mom died, I was so focused on work, on building something that would secure your future, that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me." The next morning brought news that changed the trajectory of our family forever. Ms. Rodriguez arrived at the hospital with a court order for Chloe's emergency removal from Victoria's custody, pending a full investigation into the abuse allegations. The little girl would be placed with Aunt Helena, my father's sister, who'd been approved as an emergency foster placement. As for Victoria, she was being formally investigated not just by Child Protective Services, but by the Los Angeles Police Department's Special Victims Unit. The blue residue under her fingernail might have been scrubbed away, but the forensic team had found traces of the same industrial cleaner on Chloe's pajamas and bedsheets, evidence that suggested the poisoning had been far more deliberate than anyone had initially suspected. Victoria's reaction to losing custody of Chloe was everything I'd expected, and nothing I'd prepared for. She screamed about false accusations and jealous stepdaughters, threatened lawsuits, and demanded to speak to her attorney. But underneath the righteous indignation, I could see panic starting to set in. Without Chloe under her control, her access to the trust fund became much more complicated. Without my father's continued support, her lavish lifestyle was in immediate jeopardy. For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria looked genuinely afraid, and that fear made her dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. It was David Chen who suggested I take formal steps to protect myself and my inheritance. During a private meeting in his Century City office, surrounded by law books and family portraits that spoke to generations of wealth and power, he laid out the legal realities of my situation with brutal clarity. As long as Victoria remained married to my father, she had certain rights that could complicate any attempt to hold her accountable for her actions. But if there was evidence of criminal behavior, if charges were filed and convictions obtained, those rights could be substantially limited. "The trust your grandfather established is remarkably well protected," David explained, pulling out documents that outlined the complex legal structure my family's wealth was built on. "But Victoria has been studying those protections for years, looking for vulnerabilities she could exploit. The fact that she's moved from psychological abuse to attempted murder suggests she's getting desperate, which makes her exponentially more dangerous." He recommended that I consider filing for a restraining order, hiring private security, and most importantly, establishing a paper trail that documented every interaction I had with Victoria going forward. I left David's office with a stack of legal documents and a bone-deep understanding that my life had irrevocably changed. The little girl who'd grown up believing that money could solve any problem, that wealth was a shield against the cruelties of the world, was gone. In her place was a young woman who understood that sometimes the greatest threats come from inside the fortress, that the people who claim to love you can be the ones most capable of destroying you. Victoria had tried to kill her own daughter for money, which meant there was nothing she wouldn't do to get her hands on the billion-dollar trust that represented her ultimate prize. The restraining order was granted within hours of my filing, based on the evidence of abuse against Chloe and the reasonable fear that I might be the next target. Victoria was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times, which meant she could no longer live in the family home while I was in residence. The look on her face when the papers were served was worth every sleepless night I'd spent documenting her behavior, every moment of doubt I'd endured while trying to piece together her pattern of abuse. For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria's carefully constructed facade cracked completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. But the restraining order was just the beginning. As the investigation into Chloe's poisoning expanded, more evidence emerged that painted an even darker picture of Victoria's behavior. Security footage from the house showed her entering Chloe's bathroom with cleaning supplies on the morning of the incident, then leaving empty-handed just minutes before I brought my sister home from school. Phone records revealed communications with a private investigator who'd been researching the terms of the Brennan family trust, specifically the clauses that dealt with inheritance in cases of premature death. Bank records showed suspicious transactions that suggested Victoria had been siphoning money from family accounts for months, building a war chest for whatever endgame she'd been planning. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Valdez, our housekeeper, had been quietly documenting Victoria's behavior for over a year, taking photos of suspicious bruises on Chloe's body and keeping copies of medical records that Victoria had tried to hide. She'd been afraid to speak up before, worried about losing her job and her immigration status, but the sight of Chloe fighting for her life in the hospital had given her the courage to come forward. Her testimony, combined with the physical evidence and Chloe's own statements, painted a picture of systematic child abuse that made the prosecutor's case almost ironclad. Victoria's arrest came on a Thursday morning, just as I was preparing to visit Chloe at Aunt Helena's house in Beverly Hills. I watched from my bedroom window as the police cars pulled into our circular driveway, their red and blue lights painting our manicured lawn in stark, unforgiving colors. Victoria emerged from the house in handcuffs, her perfect composure finally shattered, screaming about frame-ups and conspiracies, as the media vans that had been circling our neighborhood for days captured every moment of her downfall. The woman who'd spent years crafting the perfect image of maternal devotion was led away in designer clothes and diamond jewelry, a living contradiction that would fuel headlines for weeks to come. The charges against Victoria were extensive and serious. Attempted murder in the first degree for the poisoning of Chloe, child abuse and endangerment for the pattern of systematic mistreatment that had preceded the poisoning, financial fraud for the money she'd stolen from family accounts. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the prosecutors made it clear that they were seeking the maximum sentence allowed under California law. Victoria's attorney, a high-powered criminal defense lawyer who specialized in representing wealthy defendants, immediately began crafting a defense based on mental illness and postpartum depression, but the evidence against his client was overwhelming. As the legal proceedings unfolded, I found myself grappling with emotions I'd never expected to feel. Relief that Chloe was safe, that the truth had finally come to light, that Victoria could never hurt anyone in our family again. Anger at myself for not acting sooner, for doubting my instincts when they'd been trying to warn me about the danger we were all in. Guilt over the role that money had played in attracting Victoria to our family in the first place, over the way wealth had made us all targets in ways we'd never fully understood. And underneath it all, a profound sadness for the family we might have been if Victoria had been capable of genuine love instead of calculated manipulation. My father aged visibly during those months of legal proceedings and media scrutiny. The man who'd built an empire through sheer force of will seemed diminished by the weight of his mistakes. haunted by the knowledge that his choice in a second wife had nearly cost him both his daughters. He threw himself into therapy and spent every free moment with Chloe, trying to rebuild the trust that Victoria's abuse had shattered. He also began the process of restructuring the family trust, working with David Chen to create additional protections that would prevent anyone from ever again using our wealth as a weapon against us. The trial, when it finally came, was a media circus that attracted attention from around the world. The story had everything that fascinated the public: enormous wealth, family betrayal, attempted murder, and a beautiful defendant who tried to kill her own child for money. Victoria's defense team painted her as a victim of postpartum psychosis, a loving mother who'd been driven to desperate acts by mental illness and the pressure of living up to impossible expectations. But the prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness, presenting evidence that showed years of calculated abuse leading up to the attempted murder that had finally exposed Victoria's true nature. I testified on the third day of the trial, sitting in the witness box while Victoria stared at me with undisguised hatred from the defendant's table. I told the jury about the pattern of incidents I'd observed, about the way Victoria's behavior had escalated over time, about the fear I'd felt watching Chloe grow paler and more withdrawn under her mother's care. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a jealous stepdaughter who'd fabricated evidence to frame an innocent woman, but the facts spoke louder than his accusations. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every medical record pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. Victoria had systematically abused her daughter and had ultimately tried to kill her for money. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Guilty on all counts, with the jury deliberating for less than 6 hours before returning their decision. Victoria's composed facade finally crumbled completely as the judge read the charges and the corresponding guilty verdicts, her sobs echoing through the courtroom as the reality of her situation finally penetrated the denial she'd been living in. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but everyone knew she was facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. As I left the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters shouting questions and camera crews documenting every step, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. The nightmare was finally over. Victoria would never hurt Chloe again, would never threaten our family, would never use our wealth as a weapon against the people who should have been protected by it. The billion-dollar trust that she'd coveted would remain in the hands of the people my grandfather had intended to benefit, and Chloe would grow up knowing that she was safe, loved, and valued for who she was, rather than what she represented financially. But even as I celebrated the victory, I couldn't shake the knowledge that this story was far from over. Victoria's conviction was just the beginning of a longer process of healing and rebuilding that would take years to complete. Chloe would need therapy to process the trauma of her mother's abuse. My father would need time to forgive himself for the mistakes that had put his daughters in danger. And I would need to learn how to live with the knowledge that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones most capable of destroying you, that wealth can be both a blessing and a curse, and that protecting the people you care about sometimes requires making choices that tear your world apart. The weeks following Victoria's arrest felt like living in a house of mirrors, where every reflection showed a different version of the truth. I moved through the empty halls of Cliffside Manor like a ghost haunting her own life, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. The marble floors that once echoed with Chloe's laughter now seemed to amplify every footstep into a reminder of how close we'd come to losing her forever. My father had thrown himself into damage control mode, hiring crisis management firms and conducting endless meetings with attorneys. But I found myself craving something he couldn't provide: the simple comfort of understanding that I wasn't going insane. The media attention was relentless and suffocating. Photographers camped outside our gates like vultures, their telephoto lenses trained on every window in hopes of capturing a candid moment of grief or celebration. The story had everything the public craved: wealth, betrayal, attempted murder, and a villain so perfectly crafted she might have stepped out of a psychological thriller. Victoria's mugshot dominated tabloid covers, her once perfect face twisted with rage and desperation, while headlines screamed about the Black Widow of Malibu and the billion-dollar murder plot. I stopped reading the coverage after the third article referred to me as the, quote, heroic heiress who saved her sister's life, because heroism implied choice, and nothing about my situation had felt like a choice. Sleep became an elusive luxury during those first weeks of freedom from Victoria's presence. I would lie in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed every interaction I'd ever had with my stepmother, searching for clues I'd missed or warnings I'd ignored. The house felt different without her constant surveillance, but not necessarily safer. Victoria had been like a spider at the center of an elaborate web, and removing her had left the entire structure unstable. I found myself jumping at shadows, checking locks twice, and scrutinizing every delivery person who approached our front door. The trauma therapist Dr. Martinez had recommended explained that hypervigilance was a normal response to discovering you'd been living with someone who wanted you dead, but understanding the psychology didn't make the fear any less real. Aunt Helena became my lifeline during those dark weeks when reality felt too surreal to navigate alone. She would arrive at Cliffside Manor every morning, with coffee from my favorite Beverly Hills cafe, and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that cut through the fog of confusion and grief that seemed to follow me everywhere. Helena had never liked Victoria, she admitted during one of our long conversations in the garden overlooking the Pacific. She'd sensed something predatory about my stepmother from the beginning, but my father had been so desperate to create a normal family after my mother's death that he'd dismissed her concerns as jealousy or overprotectiveness. "I should have pushed harder," Helena said one morning as we watched Chloe play with her new therapy dog in the sprawling backyard of her Beverly Hills home. "I should have documented my suspicions, demanded answers when things didn't add up. But your father was so happy, or at least, he seemed happy, and I convinced myself that maybe I was seeing problems where none existed." Her voice carried the weight of regret that I recognized, because I'd been carrying the same burden since the night Chloe was hospitalized. We were all guilty of the same crime: trusting someone we should have questioned, prioritizing peace over protection, assuming that wealth and privilege could shield us from the kinds of horrors that happened to other families. Chloe's recovery became the focal point of our shattered family's attempt to rebuild itself. The physical damage from the chemical poisoning was healing well, but the psychological trauma ran deeper than any of us had anticipated. She would wake up screaming from nightmares about being forced to drink special medicine, and she'd developed an acute fear of anything that resembled cleaning supplies or liquid medication. The child psychologist Helena had hired specialized in abuse cases, and she explained that Chloe's symptoms were completely normal for a child who'd been systematically poisoned by her own mother. Trust, once broken, was incredibly difficult to rebuild, especially when the betrayal came from someone who was supposed to provide unconditional love and protection. During my daily visits to Helena's house, I watched my half-sister navigate her new reality with the resilience that seemed to be encoded in the Brennan DNA. She was cautious around new people, clingy with those she trusted, and prone to asking questions that broke my heart with their innocent wisdom. "Natalie, did Mommy want me to get sick?" she asked one afternoon while we were working on a puzzle together in Helena's sun-drenched living room. "Why would someone hurt their own baby?" I struggled to find age-appropriate answers to questions that I was still grappling with myself, but Chloe's therapist had emphasized the importance of honesty. Children could sense lies and half-truths, she explained, and Chloe needed to understand that what had happened to her wasn't her fault and wasn't normal. The criminal investigation into Victoria's activities expanded almost daily, as detectives uncovered layer after layer of deception and manipulation. Financial forensics experts discovered that she'd been systematically embezzling money from my father's business accounts for over 2 years, using a complex network of shell companies and fake invoices to hide her theft. The private investigator she'd hired to research the terms of the Brennan family trust had provided her with detailed information about inheritance laws, life insurance policies, and the specific circumstances that would transfer control of our wealth to her or her daughter. Most chilling of all, they found evidence that Victoria had been researching untraceable poisons and accidental death scenarios for months before she'd escalated to attempted murder. Detective Sarah Kim, the lead investigator on the case, became a regular presence in our lives as she built the prosecution's case against Victoria. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded me of my father during his most focused business negotiations. During one of our interviews, she explained that Victoria's pattern of behavior suggested she'd been planning something like this for years, possibly from the moment she'd married into our family. The systematic abuse of Chloe hadn't been random cruelty. It had been a calculated campaign to establish a pattern of accidents and illnesses that would provide cover for more serious crimes later. She was grooming everyone, Detective Kim explained during a particularly difficult session where she walked me through the timeline of Victoria's escalating abuse. Your father, the household staff, even you. She needed everyone to see her as the devoted mother dealing with a sickly, accident-prone child. That way, when something truly serious happened, it would just seem like a tragic escalation of ongoing problems. The detective's words made me physically ill, as I realized how carefully Victoria had orchestrated every aspect of her campaign against Chloe. Every bruise, every allergic reaction, every mysterious illness had been designed to lay the groundwork for murder. My father's response to learning the full extent of Victoria's crimes was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of our family's destruction. Richard Brennan was a man who'd built his fortune by reading people, by identifying their motivations and predicting their behavior with uncanny accuracy. The fact that he'd been so completely fooled by Victoria's act shattered something fundamental in his worldview. He began questioning every decision he'd made since my mother's death, every relationship he'd formed, every assumption he'd operated under. The confidence that had made him a billionaire seemed to evaporate as he confronted the reality that he'd invited a predator into his home and handed her access to everything he loved most. I failed you both, he said during one of our family therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Martinez. The trauma specialist Helena had insisted we all see together. I was so focused on providing financial security that I ignored every warning sign that should have told me Victoria was dangerous. I chose convenience over protection, and I nearly lost both my daughters because of it. The guilt he carried was visible in every line of his face, every hesitant gesture, every careful question about whether Chloe and I could ever forgive him for bringing Victoria into our lives. The therapy sessions became a lifeline for all of us, a safe space where we could acknowledge the magnitude of what had happened without worrying about media scrutiny or legal implications. Dr. Martinez specialized in families who'd experienced extreme trauma, and she helped us understand that our reactions were normal responses to an abnormal situation. She explained that betrayal trauma was particularly difficult to process because it came from someone we'd trusted, someone who'd been in a position of authority and care. The fact that Victoria had targeted children made the betrayal even more devastating, because it violated fundamental assumptions about maternal love and family safety. During one particularly intense session, Dr. Martinez asked me to describe my relationship with Victoria before the poisoning incident. As I talked about the years of subtle manipulation, the way Victoria had gradually isolated me from my father and positioned herself as the reasonable voice of authority in our household, I began to see patterns I'd missed in real time. Victoria hadn't just been planning to murder Chloe, she'd been systematically undermining my relationship with my father, creating doubts about my stability and judgment that would have made it easier to explain away my eventual accident as well. She was playing a long game, Dr. Martinez observed after I'd finished recounting years of small slights and carefully orchestrated conflicts. Abusers often spend years grooming their victims and the people around them, creating a narrative that will support their ultimate goals. In Victoria's case, she needed everyone to see you as unreliable and Chloe as fragile, so that your deaths would seem tragic but not suspicious. The clinical language made Victoria's crimes seem even more chilling, because it highlighted the calculating intelligence behind every cruel act. The impact of Victoria's betrayal extended far beyond our immediate family. Mrs. Valdez, who'd worked for us for over a decade, was racked with guilt over not speaking up sooner about the abuse she'd witnessed. She'd been afraid of losing her job, afraid of not being believed, afraid of the power Victoria wielded as the lady of the house. Her courage in finally coming forward had been crucial to building the case against Victoria, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe might not have been poisoned if she'd acted sooner. My father increased her salary and provided additional immigration support for her family, but he couldn't erase the trauma she'd experienced from watching a child be systematically abused while feeling powerless to intervene. The household staff who'd worked under Victoria's supervision revealed additional disturbing details about her behavior once they felt safe enough to speak freely. The day nurse who'd been hired to help with Chloe's frequent illnesses admitted that Victoria had often insisted on administering medications herself, refusing to let anyone else handle Chloe's care during her most vulnerable moments. The gardener mentioned seeing Victoria dispose of unusual amounts of trash on the days when Chloe had particularly severe episodes, bags that she'd specifically instructed him not to sort for recycling. Every revelation added another piece to the puzzle of Victoria's systematic campaign of abuse. David Chen, our family attorney, spent countless hours helping me understand the legal and financial implications of Victoria's crimes. The money she'd stolen would be recovered through asset forfeiture, but the process would take months or possibly years to complete. More importantly, her conviction would automatically trigger several protective clauses in the family trust that would prevent her from ever accessing our wealth, even if she somehow managed to appeal her conviction successfully. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed before marrying my father specifically voided all financial claims in cases of criminal conviction, a protection my grandfather had insisted on after watching several wealthy families destroyed by predatory marriages. "Your grandfather was paranoid about fortune hunters," David explained during one of our meetings in his Century City office. He'd seen too many families torn apart by people who married for money rather than love. The protections he built into the trust were designed to prevent exactly what Victoria attempted. I found myself grateful for my grandfather's cynicism, even as I mourned the innocence that had made such protections necessary. The idea that people would marry into families with the specific intent of murdering children for inheritance money was something I'd thought only existed in Gothic novels and true crime documentaries. The media circus surrounding Victoria's case created its own set of challenges that complicated our family's healing process. Reporters camped outside Chloe's school, Helena's house, and any restaurant or store where we might be spotted. Privacy became a luxury we couldn't afford, and every public appearance required careful coordination with security teams and legal advisors. The attention was particularly difficult for Chloe, who didn't understand why strangers wanted to take her picture or why her mother's face was on magazine covers in every grocery store checkout line. Social media amplified the invasion of privacy to levels that felt almost surreal. Amateur detectives on various platforms analyzed every photo from our family's social media accounts, looking for clues they'd missed about Victoria's true nature. Conspiracy theorists suggested that the entire case was a setup designed to protect the real killer, while others painted Victoria as a victim of a wealthy family's attempt to scapegoat her for their own crimes. The comment sections of news articles about the case became battlegrounds, where strangers debated our family's private business with a level of detail that made me question whether privacy had any meaning in the digital age. I found myself withdrawing from social interactions that had once brought me joy, unable to distinguish between genuine friendships and relationships that were motivated by curiosity about our family's tragedy. College friends who reached out after seeing the news coverage seemed more interested in getting insider details about the case than offering genuine support. Invitations to social events felt like opportunities for people to gawk at the girl whose stepmother had tried to kill her sister, and I began declining almost everything, rather than risk becoming a source of entertainment for people I'd thought I could trust. The isolation was profound and disorienting. I'd grown up in a world where wealth and privilege provided a buffer against most of life's difficulties, where problems could be solved with money and connections rather than endured with grace. But Victoria's betrayal had revealed the limits of that protection, had shown me that some threats came from inside the fortress rather than outside it. The knowledge that someone had lived in our house for years while planning to murder children for money changed my fundamental understanding of safety and trust in ways that no amount of therapy or security could completely address. Aunt Helena recognized my growing isolation and made it her mission to draw me back into the world of the living. She would arrive at Cliffside Manor with plans for small adventures, trips to farmers markets where we could lose ourselves in crowds of strangers who didn't recognize us, afternoon movies in theaters where the darkness provided temporary anonymity, or simple walks along beaches where the sound of waves drowned out the noise of helicopters and telephoto lenses. These excursions became lifelines that reminded me there was still beauty and normalcy in the world, even if our family's version of normal had been permanently altered. During one of these outings, a quiet lunch at a small cafe in Santa Monica that Helena had chosen specifically because it didn't attract the kind of clientele who read tabloid magazines, she asked me a question that forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding. "What do you want your life to look like now?" she said, her voice gentle but direct. "Not what you think you should want. Not what would make your father happy or honor your mother's memory. What do you actually want for yourself now that you're free from Victoria's influence?" The question caught me off guard because I realized I'd never really considered what I wanted independent of other people's expectations. My entire identity had been built around being Richard Brennan's daughter, the heir to a business empire I'd never particularly wanted to inherit, the survivor of a tragedy that had defined my childhood and adolescence. Victoria's presence in our lives had added another layer of performance, another set of expectations to navigate, but even with her gone, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. "I don't know," I admitted, the words feeling strange in my mouth because uncertainty was a luxury I'd rarely been allowed in a family where confidence and decisiveness were treated as cardinal virtues. I've spent so long trying to protect Chloe and figure out what was wrong with Victoria that I never thought about what comes next. It's like I've been holding my breath for years, and now I don't remember how to breathe normally. Helena nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched our family navigate multiple tragedies and understood the particular burden of inherited wealth and responsibility. "Your mother would have wanted you to find your own path," she said quietly. "She never wanted the money or the business to become a prison. That's why she fell in love with your father in the first place. Because he was building something meaningful rather than just accumulating wealth for its own sake." The mention of my mother opened a floodgate of grief and longing that I'd been suppressing since Victoria's arrest. My mother had died when I was 12, a victim of cancer that had moved through her body with devastating efficiency, despite access to the best medical care money could buy. In the years since her death, I'd idealized her memory, creating a perfect maternal figure who existed more in my imagination than in the complicated reality of actual human relationships. But Helena's words reminded me that my mother had been a real person with her own dreams and ambitions, someone who'd chosen love over security and partnership over dominance. "She would have seen through Victoria immediately," I said, tears streaming down my face as I spoke. "She would have protected Chloe. She would have protected all of us." The guilt I'd been carrying since the night of Chloe's poisoning came pouring out in ugly sobs that attracted concerned glances from other diners. Helena didn't try to stop my tears or offer empty reassurances. She simply sat with me in my grief, understanding that sometimes the only way through trauma is directly down into the depths of it. The breakdown in the cafe marked a turning point in my recovery process. For the first time since Victoria's arrest, I allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of what had happened without trying to manage or control my emotional response. The relief was extraordinary and terrifying, like finally exhaling after holding your breath until your lungs burned. Dr. Martinez had been encouraging this kind of emotional release for weeks, explaining that trauma couldn't be processed intellectually, but had to be felt and integrated on a cellular level. In the days following my breakdown, I began to notice changes in how I moved through the world. Colors seemed more vivid, food tasted better, and I found myself laughing at Chloe's silly jokes without the overlay of anxiety that had colored every interaction for months. The hypervigilance that had made me jump at every shadow began to ease, replaced by a more sustainable awareness of my surroundings that didn't require constant panic. Sleep returned gradually, first in brief snatches and then in longer stretches that left me feeling genuinely rested for the first time in months. The legal proceedings against Victoria continued to unfold with the methodical precision that characterized high-profile criminal cases. Her defense team had initially tried to negotiate a plea deal that would have resulted in a lighter sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. But the prosecution had refused any arrangement that didn't include life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The attempted murder of a child for financial gain was too serious to allow for the possibility that Victoria might someday be released to threaten other families. Her attorneys then shifted to a strategy based on mental illness, arguing that postpartum depression and prescription drug abuse had impaired her judgment to the point where she couldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. The mental health defense infuriated me in ways I struggled to articulate, even in therapy. Victoria's crimes had been too carefully planned, too methodically executed, and too perfectly concealed to be the product of mental illness alone. The research she'd conducted, the relationships she'd cultivated, the systematic abuse she'd inflicted over years, all of it spoke to a level of calculation and premeditation that was incompatible with temporary insanity or impaired judgment. She'd known exactly what she was doing, had understood the consequences of her actions, and had chosen to proceed anyway because she believed the potential rewards justified the risks. Detective Kim agreed with my assessment when I voiced these concerns during one of our preparation sessions for the upcoming trial. Mental illness can explain impulsive behavior or crimes of passion, she said, but it doesn't explain years of planning and cover-up. Victoria's behavior shows clear evidence of intent, premeditation, and awareness of right and wrong. That's why we're confident the jury will see through her defense team's attempts to paint her as a victim of her own mental state. As winter gave way to spring, our family began to establish new routines that didn't revolve around Victoria's presence or the immediate crisis of Chloe's recovery. My father hired additional security for all of our residences, but he also made an effort to ensure that the measures didn't make us feel like prisoners in our own homes. Chloe started attending a new school that specialized in working with children who'd experienced trauma, and she began to show signs of the vibrant personality that Victoria's abuse had temporarily suppressed. Helena moved into the guest house at Cliffside Manor temporarily, providing an additional layer of protection and stability while maintaining her own independence. I enrolled in graduate courses at UCLA, partly to have something constructive to focus on, and partly to begin building an identity that existed independent of my family's wealth and tragedy. The decision to pursue a master's degree in social work surprised everyone, including myself, but it felt like a natural extension of everything I'd learned during our family's crisis. If our money and privilege hadn't protected us from Victoria's predation, then other families with fewer resources were even more vulnerable to similar abuse. I wanted to develop the skills and knowledge that would allow me to help other children who might be trapped in situations like Chloe's. The graduate program also provided a form of anonymity that I'd forgotten was possible. My classmates knew I was wealthy. The designer clothes and expensive car made that obvious, but they didn't know the details of our family's recent trauma unless they specifically followed celebrity news. For the first time in months, I could be just another student wrestling with case studies and research papers, rather than the tragic heiress whose stepmother had tried to commit murder for money. The normalcy was intoxicating and healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. One of my professors, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, became an unexpected mentor during this period of reconstruction and growth. She specialized in family violence and had worked with numerous cases involving child abuse and domestic violence in wealthy families. During office hours one afternoon, she mentioned that my essay on the intersection of financial abuse and physical violence had demonstrated unusual insight into the dynamics of power and control within families. Wealth doesn't protect families from abuse, she said, echoing thoughts I'd been wrestling with since Victoria's arrest. In some ways, it makes abuse easier to hide and harder to escape. Financial dependence can trap victims just as effectively as physical isolation, and the resources that should provide protection can become weapons in the hands of abusers. Her words validated experiences I'd struggled to articulate, helping me understand that our family's suffering wasn't an aberration, but part of a larger pattern that affected families across all socioeconomic levels. As Chloe's 8th birthday approached, our family faced the challenge of creating new traditions that acknowledged our changed circumstances while still providing her with the joy and celebration every child deserved. The elaborate parties Victoria had orchestrated in previous years had been more about social media content than genuine celebration, designed to showcase her skills as a mother rather than honor Chloe's interests and personality. This year, we focused on what Chloe actually wanted: a small gathering with her new friends from school, a princess theme that reflected her current obsessions, and activities that prioritized fun over photo opportunities. The party was a revelation in its simplicity and authenticity. Chloe laughed with genuine delight as she and her friends played games in Helena's backyard, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that couldn't be manufactured or performed for cameras. Watching her blow out the candles on a cake she'd helped decorate herself, surrounded by people who loved her for who she was rather than what she represented, I felt a sense of hope that had been absent from our lives for far too long. This was what family was supposed to look like: messy, imperfect, and utterly real. The transformation in our family dynamics became most apparent during moments like these, when we could simply exist together without the constant undercurrent of tension and fear that had characterized life with Victoria. My father seemed younger somehow, more present and engaged with both his daughters than he'd been in years. He'd taken a leave of absence from the day-to-day operations of his business empire, delegating responsibilities to trusted executives, while he focused on rebuilding relationships that Victoria's manipulation had damaged. The change was remarkable and long overdue. As spring progressed towards summer, I began to feel something I could only describe as cautious optimism about our family's future. The criminal trial was still months away, and there would undoubtedly be more difficult revelations and painful testimonies to endure. But for the first time since my mother's death, we felt like a genuine family, rather than a collection of individuals trying to navigate shared trauma. Victoria's removal from our lives had created space for authentic relationships to develop, free from the manipulation and control that had poisoned every interaction for years. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with legal proceedings and media attention that would keep our private pain in the public eye for months to come. But I was beginning to understand that healing wasn't about returning to some idealized version of the past. It was about building something entirely new from the foundation of truth that Victoria's exposure had provided. We couldn't undo the damage she'd inflicted, but we could choose how to move forward with the knowledge we'd gained about ourselves and each other. The first sign that Victoria wasn't going to accept her fate quietly came on a humid Tuesday morning in July, delivered through a manila envelope that Mrs. Valdez found tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. Inside was a single photograph: Chloe playing in Helena's backyard, taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere beyond the property's security perimeter. On the back, written in Victoria's distinctive handwriting, were 4 words that made my blood freeze. "Distance means nothing, darling." I stared at the photograph with hands that shook despite the morning heat, recognizing the purple sundress Chloe had worn just 2 days earlier. Victoria was supposed to be in county jail awaiting trial, held without bail due to the severity of the charges against her. But somehow she'd managed to have this photo taken, processed, and delivered to our home. The implications were terrifying and crystal clear. Even behind bars, Victoria could still reach us. Even with all our security measures and legal protections, she could still threaten the people I loved most. Detective Kim arrived at Cliffside Manor within 30 minutes of my panicked phone call, her unmarked sedan followed by 2 patrol cars and a forensics van. She examined the photograph with the methodical precision I'd come to associate with her approach to the case, bagging it as evidence, while asking detailed questions about our recent activities and security protocols. The fact that someone had been watching Chloe, photographing her without our knowledge, represented a serious escalation that could have implications for Victoria's upcoming trial. "She's testing boundaries," Detective Kim explained as we sat in my father's study, the photograph now sealed in an evidence bag on the desk between us. Abusers often use intermediaries to maintain control over their victims, even when they're physically prevented from making direct contact. Victoria knows this photograph would terrify you, would make you question whether you're truly safe. That's exactly the reaction she was hoping for. The detective's words were logical and reassuring, but they couldn't erase the sick feeling in my stomach as I imagined strangers watching my sister play, documenting her daily routines, potentially planning something far worse than surveillance. I called Helena immediately to warn her about the photograph, and within hours Chloe was surrounded by a new team of security professionals who specialized in protecting children from specific threats. The innocence of her 8th birthday party just weeks earlier felt like a memory from another lifetime. My father's reaction to the photograph was swift and decisive in ways that reminded me why he'd been so successful in business. Within 24 hours, he'd hired a private investigation firm that specialized in tracking down harassment campaigns and cyber-stalking networks. He'd also increased security at all of our properties and arranged for Chloe to have a personal protection detail whenever she left Helena's house. The measures were extensive and expensive, but money had never been the issue. The real problem was the psychological impact of knowing that Victoria could still reach us from behind bars. The investigation into who had taken and delivered the photograph led to a disturbing discovery about the network of supporters Victoria had cultivated during her years as a social media influencer and wellness guru. Before marrying my father, she'd built a substantial following of women who admired her lifestyle and parenting philosophy, many of whom refused to believe the criminal charges against her were legitimate. They'd organized themselves into online communities dedicated to proving her innocence, and some had apparently decided to take more direct action in support of their imprisoned idol. The photographer turned out to be a woman named Crystal Martinez, a 43-year-old mother of two who lived in Ventura County and had been following Victoria's content for over 3 years. She'd driven to Malibu specifically to document what she believed was evidence of Chloe being, quote, against her will by family members who were brainwashing her against her mother. Crystal had taken dozens of photographs over several days, building what she believed was a case for Victoria's innocence that she planned to submit to various media outlets and legal advocacy groups. When police arrested Crystal at her home 2 days later, they discovered a shrine to Victoria in her garage, printouts of social media posts, newspaper clippings about the case, and handwritten letters expressing devotion and support. Crystal genuinely believed she was helping to rescue a wrongfully imprisoned mother from a conspiracy orchestrated by jealous family members. Her delusion was complete and terrifying, a reminder that Victoria's manipulation extended far beyond our immediate family into a community of followers who'd bought into her carefully crafted image. The existence of Victoria's supporter network added a new dimension of complexity to our security concerns. Detective Kim explained that this type of fanatic loyalty wasn't uncommon in high-profile criminal cases, especially those involving attractive defendants who'd cultivated public personas before their arrests. Victoria's years of social media content had created parasocial relationships with thousands of followers who felt personally connected to her success and suffering. Some percentage of those followers would inevitably refuse to accept evidence of her guilt, preferring to believe in elaborate conspiracy theories rather than acknowledge they'd been deceived. The psychological warfare escalated over the following weeks as more supporters emerged from the shadows to harass our family through various channels. Someone created fake social media accounts using Chloe's name and photographs, posting content designed to make it appear she was being abused by her current guardians. Anonymous packages arrived at our homes containing children's toys that had been deliberately broken or contaminated with substances that triggered hazmat responses. Phone calls to Helena's house featured recordings of children crying, designed to traumatize anyone who answered. Each incident by itself might have been dismissed as the work of isolated cranks, but together they formed a campaign of psychological terrorism that kept our entire family in a constant state of hypervigilance. Sleep became difficult again as I found myself listening for unusual sounds, checking locks multiple times per night, and jumping at unexpected deliveries or visitors. The progress I'd made in therapy felt fragile and threatened by this new source of stress that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as time passed. Dr. Martinez worked with our entire family to develop coping strategies for dealing with the ongoing harassment while maintaining some semblance of normal life. She explained that Victoria's supporters were essentially functioning as an extension of her abusive behavior, using fear and intimidation to maintain control over our emotional state even while she remained physically incarcerated. The goal wasn't necessarily to cause immediate physical harm, but to create a climate of fear that would undermine our sense of safety and well-being. This is a form of community-enabled abuse, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our family sessions. Victoria cultivated these relationships specifically so she could weaponize them if necessary. She understood that having devoted followers would give her power even if she lost her direct access to your family. In a way, this harassment campaign is the logical extension of everything she'd been doing to you for years. The revelation that Victoria had essentially created a network of unwitting accomplices made me understand the full scope of her manipulation in ways I'd never considered before. She hadn't just been planning to murder her daughter for money. She'd been building an entire infrastructure of support that could be activated to terrorize anyone who threatened her plans. The social media content that had seemed like harmless self-promotion had actually been a recruitment tool for gathering people who could be manipulated into serving her agenda. My father struggled more than anyone with the realization that Victoria's influence extended so far beyond our immediate family. He'd spent decades building business relationships based on trust and mutual benefit, operating in a world where people's motivations were generally transparent and rational. The idea that someone could manipulate strangers into committing crimes on their behalf challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature and social dynamics. "I keep thinking there must be something I could have done differently," he said during one particularly difficult therapy session. "Some way I could have seen through her act before she had time to build this network of supporters. But the truth is, I was completely fooled. I believed every word she said, every story she told, every explanation she gave for things that should have raised red flags immediately." Helena proved to be remarkably resilient in the face of the ongoing harassment, perhaps because her career as a family law attorney had exposed her to similar tactics from abusive ex-partners and dysfunctional family members. She treated each incident as evidence to be documented and reported, rather than personal attacks to be feared, maintaining detailed records that would eventually help law enforcement identify and prosecute several of Victoria's most aggressive supporters. Her calm professionalism in the face of escalating threats provided a stabilizing influence for all of us. The breakthrough in stopping the harassment campaign came from an unexpected source: Victoria herself. During a recorded phone call with one of her most devoted supporters, a conversation that was legally monitored as part of her pretrial detention conditions, she made statements that clearly demonstrated her direct involvement in coordinating the intimidation efforts. She provided specific instructions for future harassment activities, discussed strategies for evading law enforcement detection, and expressed satisfaction with the psychological impact the campaign was having on our family. The recording was a gift to the prosecution team building their case against Victoria, providing clear evidence of ongoing criminal activity that could result in additional charges being filed. More immediately, it gave law enforcement the legal justification they needed to crack down aggressively on her support network, leading to arrests and prosecutions that quickly dismantled the organized harassment campaign. Victoria's attempt to terrorize us from prison had ultimately provided the evidence needed to ensure she faced even more serious consequences. Detective Kim played the relevant portions of the recording for me during a meeting in the secure conference room at the Beverly Hills Police Department, her expression grim, as Victoria's voice filled the space with casual cruelty and calculated malice. Hearing my stepmother discuss strategies for traumatizing her own daughter with the same tone she might use to plan a dinner party was profoundly disturbing, but it also provided a strange sense of validation. There was no ambiguity anymore about Victoria's true nature, no room for doubt or alternative explanations. "She's not mentally ill," I said after the recording ended, my voice steady despite the emotional impact of hearing Victoria's unfiltered thoughts about our family. "She's not acting out of desperation or maternal instinct gone wrong. She's a predator who sees other people as objects to be manipulated for her benefit. The only thing she regrets is getting caught." Detective Kim nodded, her expression reflecting years of experience with similar cases. The recording makes it clear that Victoria's actions were premeditated and ongoing. "She's not a victim of circumstances or mental illness. She's a calculating criminal who's willing to use any means necessary to achieve her goals. That's going to be crucial for the jury to understand when this case goes to trial." The additional charges stemming from the harassment campaign strengthened the prosecution's case considerably, but they also meant that the trial would be delayed for several more months, while attorneys on both sides prepared to address the expanded scope of Victoria's criminal activities. The delay was frustrating for our family, extending the period of uncertainty and media attention that had already stretched far longer than any of us had anticipated. But it also provided additional time for Chloe to heal and for our family to develop more effective coping strategies. I threw myself into my graduate studies with renewed intensity, finding that academic work provided a constructive outlet for the anger and energy that might otherwise have been consumed by anxiety about Victoria's ongoing threats. My research focused increasingly on the intersection of domestic violence and financial abuse, examining how perpetrators used economic control to maintain power over their victims long after physical separation had occurred. The work felt personally meaningful in ways that surprised me, transforming my family's trauma into knowledge that might help other families avoid similar situations. Professor Hartwell encouraged me to consider publishing some of my research, suggesting that my unique perspective as both a victim and a scholar could provide valuable insights for practitioners working with wealthy families experiencing abuse. The idea of making our private pain public in service of a larger cause was initially terrifying, but I began to see it as a form of justice that Victoria couldn't touch or undermine. If our suffering could prevent other children from experiencing similar abuse, then perhaps some meaning could be extracted from the meaningless cruelty we'd endured. The summer progressed with a rhythm of small victories and temporary setbacks that gradually tilted toward healing and recovery. Chloe's nightmares became less frequent, and she began to show interest in activities beyond the intensive therapy that had dominated her schedule for months. She started taking riding lessons at a stable in Malibu Canyon, finding joy and confidence in her relationship with the gentle horses that seemed to understand her need for unconditional acceptance. Watching her laugh as she brushed down her favorite mare, I saw glimpses of the vibrant child she'd been before Victoria's abuse had dimmed her natural light. My father began to re-engage with his business responsibilities, but in a more balanced way that prioritized family time and personal relationships over pure financial growth. He'd learned that all the money in the world couldn't protect the people he loved if he wasn't present enough to recognize threats when they emerged. The lesson had come at a terrible cost, but it had fundamentally changed his approach to both business and family in ways that would benefit all of us going forward. Helena made the decision to move permanently into the guest house at Cliffside Manor, creating a multi-generational living arrangement that provided stability and support for everyone involved. Her presence transformed the dynamics of our household in ways that reminded me of what family life had been like before my mother's death, when multiple adults shared responsibility for childcare and no one person carried the entire burden of maintaining family harmony. The arrangement also provided an additional layer of security that made all of us feel safer. The media attention surrounding our case began to shift from sensational coverage of Victoria's crimes to more thoughtful examinations of the broader issues her case represented. Several reputable journalists wrote in-depth pieces about financial abuse in wealthy families, the ways that social media could be weaponized by domestic abusers, and the challenges law enforcement faced when investigating crimes that crossed traditional socioeconomic boundaries. The coverage was still invasive and often painful, but it felt more purposeful than the tabloid sensationalism that had dominated the early reporting. One particularly impactful article appeared in the New York Times Magazine, written by an investigative journalist who'd spent months researching similar cases across the country. She'd interviewed dozens of families who'd experienced financial and psychological abuse from partners, family members, and caregivers who'd used wealth and social status to hide their crimes. Victoria's case was presented as part of a larger pattern of abuse that affected far more families than most people realized, challenging assumptions about who could be victims and what domestic violence looked like in different socioeconomic contexts. The article generated significant discussion in academic and professional circles, leading to invitations for me to speak at conferences and workshops about family violence prevention. Initially, I declined these opportunities, feeling too raw and vulnerable to discuss our private trauma in public forums. But as my confidence grew and my understanding of the larger issues deepened, I began to see public speaking as an extension of the advocacy work I was pursuing through my graduate studies. My first speaking engagement was at a conference hosted by the UCLA School of Social Work, addressing an audience of professionals who worked with families experiencing various forms of abuse and trauma. Standing at the podium, looking out at 200 social workers, therapists, and legal advocates, I felt a mixture of terror and purpose that reminded me of the moment I'd decided to call CPS about Victoria's abuse of Chloe. The decision to speak publicly about our family's experience felt like another form of protection, a way of ensuring that our story would serve a larger purpose beyond our personal healing. The response to my presentation was overwhelming and humbling. Dozens of audience members approached me afterward to share their own experiences with financial abuse and manipulation, many describing situations that echoed elements of Victoria's behavior patterns. Several mentioned that hearing our story had helped them recognize warning signs in their own cases that they'd previously dismissed or minimized. The knowledge that our suffering might prevent other children from experiencing similar abuse provided a sense of meaning that therapy alone couldn't offer. As autumn approached and the trial date was finally confirmed for January, our family had developed a new equilibrium that felt sustainable and authentic in ways our previous life never had. We'd learned to live with appropriate caution, without allowing fear to dominate our daily decisions. We'd built support systems that didn't depend on any single person carrying an unreasonable burden. Most importantly, we'd developed the communication skills and emotional vocabulary needed to address problems before they escalated into crises. The continuing legal proceedings remained a source of stress and uncertainty, but they no longer felt like threats to our fundamental survival. Victoria's additional charges had eliminated any possibility of a plea bargain that might have resulted in her eventual release, and the evidence against her was so overwhelming that even her most devoted supporters were beginning to question their loyalty. The harassment campaign had largely collapsed after several high-profile arrests, leaving only scattered incidents that law enforcement could handle through routine procedures. Chloe's progress was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of our family's recovery. The little girl who'd nearly died from her mother's attempt to poison her had developed into a confident, articulate child who could discuss her experiences with a maturity that amazed her therapists. She understood that what had happened to her wasn't her fault, that mothers weren't supposed to hurt their children, and that the people caring for her now could be trusted to keep her safe. Her resilience was a daily reminder that healing was possible, even after the most severe trauma. The private investigation into Victoria's background, which had continued throughout the summer, revealed additional disturbing information about her past that would likely be relevant to the upcoming trial. She'd been married twice before meeting my father, both relationships ending in acrimonious divorces that involved allegations of financial manipulation and child endangerment. Her first husband had obtained a restraining order after Victoria allegedly poisoned their family dog during a custody dispute. Her second marriage had ended after their infant son was hospitalized multiple times with mysterious illnesses that stopped occurring after Victoria lost custody. The pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. Victoria had been refining her methods of abuse and manipulation for over a decade before she'd targeted our family. We weren't her first victims. We were simply the wealthiest, representing the culmination of her evolution from petty financial fraud to attempted murder for inheritance. The knowledge that other families had suffered at her hands was deeply disturbing, but it also provided crucial context for understanding the calculated nature of her crimes against us. Detective Kim shared this information with me during one of our final preparation sessions before the trial, her expression reflecting the same mixture of professional satisfaction and personal revulsion that I'd come to associate with her approach to the case. Victoria's criminal career had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized, spanning multiple states and involving numerous victims who'd been too intimidated or ashamed to report her behavior to authorities. She's been doing this her entire adult life, Detective Kim explained, spreading photographs and documents across the conference room table like pieces of a massive puzzle finally coming together. The only thing that changed with your family was the scale of the potential payout. Everything else, the manipulation, the gradual escalation of abuse, the careful construction of alibis and alternative explanations, it's all consistent with her previous behavior patterns. The revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about Victoria's relationship with our family. She hadn't married my father and gradually become abusive through some combination of greed and mental illness. She'd targeted him specifically because he represented the kind of wealth that could justify the level of risk involved in attempting murder. Our family had been marked for destruction from the moment she'd learned about the Brennan family trust, with every subsequent interaction serving the ultimate goal of eliminating obstacles to her inheritance. As the leaves began to change color in the mountains above Malibu, I found myself looking forward to the trial, with something approaching eagerness rather than dread. The months of harassment and intimidation had ultimately backfired, providing additional evidence of Victoria's criminal mindset while strengthening our family's resolve to see justice done. We'd survived her worst efforts to terrorize us from prison, and we'd emerged stronger and more united than we'd been in years. The knowledge that Victoria had a long history of similar crimes made her conviction feel inevitable rather than merely probable. No jury would be able to listen to testimony from multiple victims across multiple states and conclude that her behavior represented anything other than a calculated pattern of predatory abuse. Her attempt to manipulate supporters into terrorizing us had eliminated any remaining sympathy she might have garnered from people who wanted to believe in alternative explanations for her behavior. Most importantly, Chloe would soon have the legal closure needed to fully move forward with her life. The little girl who'd survived attempted murder deserved to know that her abuser would never again have the opportunity to hurt children. The trial would provide that certainty, along with the public acknowledgement that what had happened to her was real, serious, and completely unacceptable. After months of healing in private, she would finally see justice delivered in a forum that validated her suffering and condemned her abuser. The morning of January 15th dawned gray and cold, with the kind of marine layer that made the Pacific Ocean disappear into a wall of mist beyond our windows. I stood in my bedroom at Cliffside Manor, smoothing down the navy blue dress I'd chosen for the opening day of Victoria's trial, trying to quiet the nervous energy that had been building for weeks. Today, after 18 months of investigation, preparation, and legal maneuvering, Victoria would finally face a jury of her peers who would decide whether she spent the rest of her life in prison or somehow managed to escape justice for her crimes. The courthouse in downtown Los Angeles was surrounded by media vans and protesters when our security convoy arrived, creating a circus atmosphere that seemed obscene given the gravity of what we were there to address. Supporters of Victoria, diminished in number but not in fervor, held signs proclaiming her innocence and demanding justice for what they called a quote, wrongfully accused mother. Counter-protesters carried banners supporting child abuse victims and calling for maximum sentences for those who hurt children. The cacophony of competing chants and shouted questions from reporters created a wall of sound that felt physically oppressive. District Attorney Margaret Chen led the prosecution team with the kind of quiet intensity that had made her reputation as one of California's most effective prosecutors of violent crimes. She'd explained during our preparation meetings that Victoria's case represented everything she'd dedicated her career to fighting: the exploitation of vulnerable victims by predators who used wealth, status, and manipulation to hide their crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, she'd assured us, but trials involving wealthy defendants and complex financial arrangements always carried the risk of unexpected complications. Victoria's appearance in the courtroom was carefully calculated to evoke sympathy from the jury. Gone was the designer wardrobe and professional makeup that had characterized her public image for years. Instead, she wore a simple gray dress that made her look pale and fragile, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the weight she'd lost during her incarceration. Her defense team had clearly coached her in projecting vulnerability rather than the calculating confidence that had marked her interactions with our family. Lead defense attorney Marcus Steinberg was known for his ability to create reasonable doubt in seemingly impossible cases, using emotional manipulation and character assassination to confuse juries about the fundamental facts of criminal behavior. His opening statement painted Victoria as a devoted mother suffering from undiagnosed mental illness, driven to desperate acts by postpartum depression and prescription drug abuse that had impaired her judgment. He suggested that the Brennan family had scapegoated Victoria to cover up their own dysfunctional dynamics, presenting her prosecution as a miscarriage of justice orchestrated by wealthy people accustomed to using their influence to destroy anyone who threatened their interests. DHN's opening statement was a masterpiece of clear, factual presentation that methodically dismantled the defense's attempts to create alternative narratives. She walked the jury through the timeline of Victoria's systematic abuse of Chloe, the extensive planning that had preceded the poisoning attempt, and the harassment campaign Victoria had orchestrated from prison to intimidate witnesses and tamper with the investigation. By the time she finished speaking, Victoria's claims of mental illness and victimization seemed not just implausible, but actively insulting to anyone capable of basic reasoning. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the facts of Chloe's poisoning and the immediate aftermath that had led to Victoria's arrest. Dr. Martinez testified about the specific type of chemical burns that had damaged Chloe's throat and stomach, explaining that the pattern of injury was consistent with forced ingestion rather than accidental consumption. The emergency room records painted a devastating picture of a small child fighting for her life, while her mother provided misleading information to medical professionals trying to determine the cause of her symptoms. Mrs. Valdez's testimony was perhaps the most emotionally powerful of the early proceedings. Speaking through a translator, she described years of witnessing Victoria's escalating abuse of Chloe, while feeling powerless to intervene due to her immigration status and economic dependence on our family. Her voice broke as she recounted finding Chloe unconscious in her bedroom on multiple occasions after Victoria had administered what she called special medicine, incidents that had been explained away as seizures or allergic reactions but that Mrs. Valdez now understood were deliberate poisonings. The defense's cross-examination of Mrs. Valdez was brutal and xenophobic, with Steinberg attempting to paint her as an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by revenge against an employer who'd supposedly mistreated her. His questions about her immigration status and limited English skills were clearly designed to make the jury question her credibility, but the strategy backfired spectacularly. Mrs. Valdez's dignity and obvious love for Chloe shone through every answer, making Steinberg look like a bully attacking someone who'd shown tremendous courage in speaking out against abuse. Detective Kim's testimony provided the foundation for understanding Victoria's crimes within the broader context of financial fraud and inheritance manipulation. She walked the jury through the extensive investigation that had uncovered Victoria's research into the Brennan family trust, her communications with private investigators about inheritance laws, and her systematic theft of money from family accounts to fund her various schemes. The evidence painted a picture of someone who'd been planning complex financial crimes for years before escalating to attempted murder. The most damaging testimony came from Victoria's previous victims, women who'd been married to her before she'd targeted my father, and whose children had suffered similar patterns of abuse. Jennifer Walsh, Victoria's first ex-husband's sister, testified about the mysterious death of their family dog and the series of accidents that had befallen her young nephew during custody visits. Patricia Moreno, the mother of Victoria's second stepchild, described a pattern of deliberate poisonings that had stopped immediately after Victoria lost access to her son following their divorce. These women had never met each other before the trial, had never coordinated their stories or compared their experiences, yet their testimonies revealed an identical pattern of behavior that made Victoria's claims of mental illness seem ludicrous. She'd been refining her methods for over a decade, learning from each failed relationship and improving her ability to manipulate both victims and authorities. Our family represented the culmination of her criminal evolution, the target that would have provided enough money to justify the ultimate risk of murder. Victoria's ex-husbands testified via video link, both men clearly traumatized by their interactions with a woman they'd once trusted with their children's lives. Dr. Michael Walsh described coming home from work to find his 3-year-old son unconscious, and his wife claiming the child had suffered a seizure, a pattern that had repeated multiple times before he'd realized the seizures only occurred when Victoria was alone with his son. James Moreno's testimony was even more devastating, as he described finding industrial-strength cleaning supplies hidden in his infant son's nursery and Victoria's panicked reaction when he'd confronted her about their presence. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. Victoria had been attempting to murder children for over a decade, perfecting her methods and alibis through trial and error, while moving from family to family in search of bigger financial payoffs. The jury's faces reflected growing revulsion as they absorbed the magnitude of her crimes, the careful planning that had gone into each attempt, and the calculating coldness that had allowed her to repeatedly target the most vulnerable members of multiple families. Chloe's testimony was scheduled for the second week of the trial, and the days leading up to her appearance in court were filled with intensive preparation designed to minimize the trauma of facing her abuser in a public forum. Child advocacy specialists worked with her to understand the courtroom layout, the role of various participants, and the types of questions she would be asked. Special accommodations were made to allow her to testify via closed-circuit television, sparing her the intimidation of being in the same room as Victoria, while ensuring her words reached the jury with full impact. The morning of Chloe's testimony, I sat in the victim's gallery, watching my 9-year-old sister speak with remarkable clarity and courage about the woman who'd tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she described the special medicine Victoria had forced her to drink, the way it had burned her throat, and made her stomach feel like it was quote, full of fire. She talked about being scared to tell anyone because Victoria had warned her that speaking about their special times would result in terrible consequences for our entire family. The defense's cross-examination of Chloe was carefully limited by the judge, but Steinberg still managed to suggest that a child's memory might be unreliable and that her testimony had been influenced by adult coaching. His questions were gentle in tone, but insidious in their implication, attempting to plant seeds of doubt about whether a 9-year-old could accurately recall traumatic events that had occurred months earlier. Chloe's responses demolished these suggestions with the kind of specific detail that only comes from lived experience, rather than external coaching. "She made me drink it from my princess cup," Chloe said when asked about the poisoning incident, her voice clear and unwavering. "It was blue like the cleaner in the bathroom, and it tasted like metal and hurt my tongue right away. I told her it was yucky, but she said if I didn't finish it all, something bad would happen to Natalie. I was scared for my sister, so I drank it, even though it made me want to throw up." The impact of Chloe's testimony on the jury was immediately visible. Several jurors wiped away tears as they listened to a child describe being manipulated into consuming poison through threats against her sister's safety. The calculated cruelty of using Chloe's love for me as a weapon to ensure her compliance with her own attempted murder was perhaps the most damning evidence of Victoria's complete lack of maternal instinct or basic human decency. My own testimony came during the 3rd week, and stepping into the witness box felt like entering a battlefield where every word would be scrutinized for weaknesses or inconsistencies. D.A. Chen guided me through my observations of Victoria's behavior over the years, the pattern of incidents that had led to my growing suspicions, and the night of Chloe's poisoning when everything had finally become clear. I described finding the blue residue under Victoria's fingernail, the calculated nature of her response to the medical emergency, and the sick realization that someone I'd lived with for years had been planning to murder children for money. Steinberg's cross-examination was aggressive and personal, designed to paint me as a jealous stepdaughter who'd fabricated evidence to frame an innocent woman. He questioned my motives for calling CPS, suggested that my wealth and privilege had given me undue influence over the investigation, and implied that my testimony was motivated by resentment over having to share my father's attention and money with Victoria and Chloe. His strategy was transparent but potentially effective. If he could convince the jury that I was the real villain in this story, Victoria might escape conviction despite the overwhelming evidence against her. "Isn't it true, Miss Brennan, that you resented your stepmother from the moment she married your father?" Steinberg asked, his voice carrying the kind of false sympathy that trial lawyers use when they're preparing to attack. "Isn't it true that you saw her and her daughter as threats to your inheritance and your relationship with your father? Isn't it possible that your accusations against Victoria are motivated by financial greed rather than genuine concern for your sister's welfare?" The questions were designed to make me defensive and emotional, to provoke the kind of angry reaction that would undermine my credibility with the jury. But months of therapy and preparation had given me tools for maintaining composure under attack, and I answered each insinuation with calm precision. I acknowledged that blended families were complicated, and that I'd initially had reservations about Victoria, but I emphasized that my concerns had been based on observed behavior, rather than financial jealousy or personal resentment. I called CPS because I found chemical residue under my stepmother's fingernail after my sister was poisoned, I said, looking directly at the jury as I spoke. I called them because Chloe's symptoms didn't match accidental ingestion, and because Victoria's explanations kept changing in ways that didn't make sense. I called them because a child nearly died, and someone needed to investigate whether it was really an accident. Everything else is irrelevant compared to protecting an 8-year-old girl from further harm. The prosecution's case concluded with financial experts who testified about Victoria's systematic theft from family accounts and her extensive research into inheritance laws and life insurance policies. The evidence showed that she'd been planning some form of financial crime from shortly after her marriage to my father, with the specific focus on eliminating heirs becoming clear only in the months before Chloe's poisoning. The paper trail was exhaustive and damning, revealing a level of premeditation that made claims of mental illness or temporary insanity completely untenable. Victoria's defense team called a parade of mental health experts who testified about postpartum depression, prescription drug abuse, and the psychological pressures of living in a wealthy family. Their testimony was carefully crafted to suggest that Victoria's crimes were the product of mental illness rather than calculating greed, emphasizing her lack of prior convictions and the absence of obvious financial motive given her marriage to a billionaire. The strategy might have been effective in a different case, but the evidence of long-term planning and multiple victims made it impossible to credibly argue that Victoria's behavior was impulsive or irrational. The most dramatic moment of the defense case came when Victoria herself took the stand, against the advice of most legal experts who'd been following the trial. Her testimony was a masterclass in manipulation and victimization, portraying herself as a loving mother who'd been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of caring for a sickly child while dealing with her own untreated mental illness. She claimed to have no memory of the poisoning incident, suggesting that prescription drug abuse had created blackouts that explained her inability to account for her actions on the day Chloe was hospitalized. Victoria's performance was polished and emotionally compelling, complete with tears at appropriate moments and expressions of devastation when discussing the charges against her. She spoke lovingly about Chloe, expressing grief over being separated from her daughter and confusion about how their relationship had deteriorated so dramatically. Her acting was nearly flawless, and I could see some jurors responding to her apparent vulnerability and maternal distress. DHN's cross-examination of Victoria was surgical in its precision, methodically dismantling every claim and revealing the calculated nature of her testimony. Chen confronted Victoria with evidence of her internet searches for information about poisoning symptoms, her communications with private investigators about inheritance laws, and her recorded conversations from prison discussing strategies for intimidating witnesses. Each question peeled away another layer of Victoria's carefully constructed facade, revealing the cold calculation underneath. The most devastating moment came when Chen played recordings of Victoria's phone calls from prison, conversations in which she discussed Chloe with the same emotional detachment she might use to describe a business transaction. In one particularly damning recording, Victoria referred to her daughter as, quote, collateral damage in her conflict with our family, and expressed regret that the poisoning hadn't been more successful. The contrast between her courtroom performance and her unguarded comments when she thought no one was listening was stark and unmistakable. You referred to your own daughter as collateral damage, Chen said, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and disgust. You expressed regret that the poisoning hadn't killed her. Do those sound like the words of a loving mother suffering from mental illness? Or do they sound like the words of someone who sees children as obstacles to be eliminated? Victoria's attempt to explain away the recordings was pathetic and unconvincing, marked by stammering denials and claims that her words had been taken out of context. The closing arguments began on a Friday morning in early March, with DHN delivering a summation that tied together months of testimony into a compelling narrative of predatory abuse and attempted murder. She reminded the jury of Victoria's pattern of behavior across multiple relationships, the extensive planning that had preceded Chloe's poisoning, and the harassment campaign she'd orchestrated from prison to intimidate witnesses and tamper with the investigation. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Victoria was a serial child abuser who'd escalated to attempted murder when the potential financial payoff justified the increased risk. Steinberg's closing argument was a last, desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt by emphasizing Victoria's lack of obvious motive and the possibility that mental illness had impaired her judgment. He portrayed her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, driven to desperate acts by untreated depression and prescription drug abuse. His presentation was skillful and emotionally manipulative, but it couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence that demonstrated Victoria's crimes were premeditated and calculating rather than impulsive and irrational. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict, a relatively quick decision in a case involving such complex financial and psychological evidence. I sat in the front row of the victim's gallery as the foreman stood to read the verdict, my hands clasped tightly in my lap as I tried to prepare myself for either outcome. The possibility that Victoria might somehow escape conviction despite the overwhelming evidence against her had haunted my dreams for weeks, and I wouldn't truly believe in justice until I heard the words spoken aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant Victoria Brennan guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. the foreman announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The words hit me like a physical force, releasing tension I'd been carrying for nearly 2 years. Additional guilty verdicts followed for child abuse, financial fraud, witness intimidation, and conspiracy charges, each one another nail in the coffin of Victoria's claims of innocence and victimization. Victoria's reaction to the verdict was everything I'd expected and nothing I was prepared for. Her carefully maintained composure cracked completely as the reality of her situation finally penetrated the denial she'd been living in. She screamed about frame-ups and conspiracies, accusing my family of buying justice and the jury of being prejudiced against her because of her background. Her mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the rage and entitlement that had always lurked beneath her performance of maternal devotion. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but everyone knew Victoria was facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. The attempted murder conviction alone carried a life sentence, and the additional charges would ensure she never had another opportunity to harm children or manipulate vulnerable families. Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation for harsh sentences in cases involving crimes against children, and Victoria's lack of remorse and continued attempts to manipulate the proceedings had clearly angered her. As we left the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters and photographers documenting every moment of our family's vindication, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my mother's death: complete and total peace. The nightmare was finally over. Victoria would never hurt Chloe again, would never threaten our family, would never use her intelligence and charm to destroy other innocent families. Justice had been served in the most public and definitive way possible. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive and overwhelmingly positive, with editorial writers and legal experts praising the thoroughness of the investigation and the courage of the family members who'd testified against Victoria. Several articles noted that the case had highlighted important issues about financial abuse in wealthy families and the ways that predators could use social media and personal relationships to hide their crimes. Our private tragedy had become a public lesson about vigilance and the importance of believing children who reported abuse. Chloe's reaction to the verdict was perhaps the most meaningful aspect of our victory. She understood that the bad mommy who'd hurt her would never be able to hurt children again, and that knowledge seemed to lift a weight from her small shoulders that she'd been carrying since the night of her poisoning. Her nightmares stopped almost immediately, and she began talking about the future with an optimism that reminded me of the confident little girl she'd been before Victoria's abuse had dimmed her natural light. My father's response to the verdict was more complex, marked by relief that justice had been served, but also by continued guilt over his role in bringing Victoria into our lives. The trial had forced him to confront the reality that his desperation to create a normal family after my mother's death had blinded him to obvious warning signs about Victoria's true nature. His journey toward forgiveness, both of himself and of the circumstances that had made our family vulnerable, would take longer than the legal proceedings that had just concluded. Helena's satisfaction with the verdict was evident in every line of her face as we walked out of the courthouse together, Chloe's small hand securely clasped in hers. She'd been Victoria's most consistent opponent from the beginning, the one family member who'd never been fooled by the performance of maternal devotion. Her vindication was complete and well-deserved, proof that sometimes skepticism and vigilance are forms of love rather than paranoia or jealousy. The weeks following the verdict brought a sense of closure that allowed our family to begin planning for a future that didn't revolve around legal proceedings and security concerns. The media attention would continue for a while longer, but the most intense scrutiny was behind us. Victoria's conviction had provided the definitive ending that would allow us to move forward with confidence that the truth had been acknowledged and justice had been served. As spring arrived in Malibu and the ocean began to warm under longer days of sunshine, I found myself looking toward the future with genuine excitement for the first time in years. The little girl who'd grown up believing that wealth and privilege could protect her from life's cruelties had been replaced by a young woman who understood that sometimes the greatest threats come from inside the fortress. But I'd also learned that truth and perseverance could triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of manipulation and abuse. Victoria's conviction wasn't just justice for our family. It was proof that predators couldn't hide behind wealth, status, or carefully crafted public images forever. Victoria's sentencing hearing took place on a crisp morning in late April, when the California sunshine streaming through the courthouse windows felt like a promise of renewal after the long winter of legal proceedings. Judge Patricia Williams had scheduled 2 hours for victim impact statements, allocating time for our family to address the court about how Victoria's crimes had affected our lives. The opportunity to speak directly to the woman who'd tried to destroy us felt both empowering and surreal, a chance to reclaim our narrative after months of having our private pain dissected in public forums. I had spent weeks crafting my statement, struggling to find words that could adequately convey the magnitude of Victoria's betrayal without reducing our family's experience to mere talking points in a legal proceeding. How do you explain to a judge the peculiar trauma of discovering that someone you'd trusted with your life had been systematically planning to end it? How do you articulate the way that kind of betrayal changes your fundamental understanding of safety, trust, and human nature? The speech I eventually wrote was both deeply personal and deliberately universal, designed to help others understand the broader implications of Victoria's crimes. Your Honor, I began, standing at the podium with Victoria seated just 20 feet away, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the designer clothes that had once been her armor. Victoria didn't just try to kill my sister, she tried to murder the very concept of family itself. She weaponized trust, perverted love, and turned the most sacred relationship in human society into a vehicle for destruction. When someone poisons a child they've claimed to nurture, they're not just committing attempted murder, they're attacking the fundamental bonds that hold civilization together. Chloe was too young to deliver her own victim impact statement, but Helena read a letter that my sister had dictated with the help of her therapist. The words were simple but devastating in their innocence. I used to think mommies loved their babies no matter what. Now I know that some mommies are sick in their hearts and need to be locked away so they can't hurt more children. I'm not scared anymore because the judge and the police and my family are keeping me safe. But I still have bad dreams sometimes about the special medicine that burned my throat. The letter continued with Chloe's description of her recovery and her hopes for other children who might be experiencing similar abuse. Her therapist had helped her understand that speaking about her experience could protect other families from predators like Victoria, transforming her suffering into a form of advocacy that gave meaning to her trauma. The 9-year-old who'd nearly died from her mother's attempt to poison her had become an unexpected voice for child protection, her words carrying more moral authority than any legal expert or policy advocate. My father's statement was perhaps the most painful to hear, marked by a self-recrimination that no amount of therapy had been able to fully address. He spoke about the ways that wealth and privilege had created blind spots that Victoria had exploited, acknowledging his failure to protect his daughters from a predator he'd invited into their home. His voice broke as he described the guilt he carried over Chloe's suffering, the knowledge that his desperation to create a normal family had nearly cost him both his children. I failed in the most fundamental duty of parenthood, he said, his usually confident voice reduced to a whisper that barely carried to the back of the courtroom. I brought a monster into my home and called her mother. I gave her access to everything I treasured most in this world, and she used that access to try to destroy it. No sentence you impose could be more severe than the knowledge that my poor judgment nearly resulted in the murder of an innocent child. Helena's statement focused on the broader implications of Victoria's crimes for other wealthy families who might be vulnerable to similar predators. She spoke about the need for better screening procedures for people seeking to marry into established families, the importance of prenuptial agreements that included background investigations, and the responsibility of family courts to take financial motivations seriously in custody and inheritance disputes. Her years as a family law attorney had given her insight into the systemic vulnerabilities that people like Victoria exploited. Mrs. Valdez delivered her statement in Spanish, with a translator conveying her words to the court in halting English that somehow made them more powerful. She spoke about the impossible position Victoria had put her in, using immigration status and economic dependence to silence someone who'd witnessed years of systematic abuse. Her courage in finally speaking out had been crucial to building the case against Victoria. but it had come at enormous personal cost that would affect her for years to come. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation was unambiguous: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the financial fraud and witness intimidation charges. District Attorney Chen argued that Victoria's crimes represented such a fundamental violation of trust and human decency that rehabilitation was neither possible nor relevant. The systematic nature of her abuse, the careful planning that had preceded her attempt to murder Chloe, and her complete lack of remorse made her an ongoing threat to any community that might eventually house her. Victoria's defense team made a final desperate plea for leniency, arguing that their client's mental health issues warranted treatment rather than purely punitive incarceration. Steinberg painted Victoria as a victim of untreated postpartum depression and prescription drug abuse, suggesting that appropriate medical intervention might have prevented her crimes. The argument rang hollow after months of evidence demonstrating the calculating nature of Victoria's behavior, but it was the only strategy available to attorneys representing someone whose guilt had been established beyond any reasonable doubt. When Judge Williams asked Victoria if she wished to address the court before sentencing, I expected another performance of victimization and false remorse. Instead, Victoria rose from her chair with a composure that reminded me uncomfortably of the woman who'd once presided over family dinners and school events. For a moment, her mask slipped back into place, revealing the intelligence and charisma that had initially attracted my father and fooled our entire family for years. Your Honor, I stand before you today as a woman who has lost everything that ever mattered to her, Victoria began, her voice carrying the same melodious quality that had once charmed donors at charity events and impressed other parents at school functions. I have lost my husband, my daughter, my freedom, and my reputation. I have been vilified in the media and condemned by people who never knew the real person behind the accusations and innuendo. The speech that followed was a masterpiece of manipulation that managed to acknowledge her conviction while still maintaining her innocence, expressing regret for the tragic misunderstandings that had torn our family apart without accepting responsibility for deliberately poisoning a child. Victoria portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, driven to desperate acts by mental illness and family dysfunction that predated her arrival in our lives. She expressed love for Chloe while simultaneously suggesting that the child's testimony had been influenced by adult coaching and family pressure. I know that I am not perfect, Victoria continued, tears beginning to stream down her carefully composed face. I know that I made mistakes in my role as a stepmother and wife. But I also know in my heart that I never intended to harm anyone, especially not the little girl I came to love as my own daughter. If my actions contributed to Chloe's injuries, it was through negligence rather than malice, through mental illness rather than criminal intent. The performance was so polished and emotionally compelling that I found myself momentarily questioning my own memories and perceptions, wondering if there was some possibility that we'd all been wrong about Victoria's motivations and intentions. The doubt lasted only seconds before I remembered the recordings of her prison phone calls, the calculated cruelty in her voice as she'd discussed strategies for intimidating witnesses and expressed regret that Chloe's poisoning hadn't been more successful. Victoria was still manipulating, still performing, still refusing to acknowledge the reality of what she'd done to a helpless child. Judge Williams listened to Victoria's statement with the expression of someone who'd heard similar speeches from countless defendants over the course of a long judicial career. When Victoria finished and resumed her seat, the judge took several minutes to review her notes before delivering a sentence that would determine how Victoria spent the rest of her natural life. The courtroom was absolutely silent, as everyone waited to hear whether justice would truly be served or whether Victoria's final performance had somehow created doubt about the severity of her crimes. Mrs. Brennan, Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who dedicated her career to protecting society's most vulnerable members. Over the course of this trial, I have heard extensive testimony about your systematic abuse of a child who trusted you to provide care and protection. I have reviewed evidence of your deliberate research into methods of poisoning, your careful planning of what you hoped would appear to be accidental death, and your attempts to intimidate witnesses and manipulate the legal process even while incarcerated. The judge continued by addressing Victoria's claims of mental illness and diminished capacity. pointing out that her behavior had been far too organized and goal-oriented to be the product of impaired judgment or temporary insanity. The extensive planning that had preceded Chloe's poisoning, combined with the evidence of similar crimes against other children in previous relationships, demonstrated a pattern of calculated predatory behavior that posed an ongoing threat to public safety. "Your crimes represent a particularly heinous form of betrayal," Judge Williams said, her voice growing harder as she addressed Victoria directly. "You accepted the trust and responsibility that comes with caring for a child, and you used that position to systematically abuse and ultimately attempt to murder someone who depended on you for protection. The fact that your motivation was financial gain makes your crimes even more despicable, as it demonstrates a complete absence of maternal instinct or basic human empathy." The sentence that followed was everything our family had hoped for, and everything Victoria had dreaded: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the attempted murder conviction, plus consecutive sentences totaling an additional 75 years for the related charges. Even if the murder conviction were somehow overturned on appeal, the additional sentences would ensure that Victoria remained incarcerated for the rest of her natural life. She would never again have the opportunity to harm children or manipulate vulnerable families. Victoria's reaction to the sentence was swift and explosive, revealing the rage and entitlement that had always lurked beneath her carefully constructed facade. She screamed about frame-ups and corrupted justice, accusing my family of buying her conviction and the judge of being prejudiced against her because of her background. Court security officers moved quickly to restrain her as she continued her tirade, finally revealing the true nature that she'd hidden behind years of perfect performance. As Victoria was led away in shackles, still screaming about injustice and conspiracy, I felt a profound sense of closure that went beyond simple satisfaction with the legal outcome. The woman who'd terrorized our family for years was finally being held accountable for her crimes, but more importantly, her mask had been completely torn away. No one who witnessed her breakdown in the courtroom could maintain any illusions about her true character or the justice of her conviction. The months following Victoria's sentencing brought a gradual return to something resembling normal life, though our definition of normal had been permanently altered by everything we'd experienced. Chloe continued her therapy and began to show signs of the resilient, joyful child she'd been before Victoria's abuse had traumatized her. She started asking questions about her biological father, a topic that had been too complicated to address while she was dealing with the immediate aftermath of Victoria's crimes. My father worked with Helena and a team of family counselors to help Chloe understand her origins in age-appropriate terms. Victoria had never identified Chloe's biological father, claiming he'd been a brief romantic relationship that had ended before she'd realized she was pregnant. DNA testing and private investigation eventually revealed that the man Victoria had claimed was Chloe's father had never existed. She'd fabricated his entire identity as part of her strategy for attracting wealthy men who might be sympathetic to a single mother's plight. The revelation that Chloe's paternity was unknown added another layer of complexity to our family's healing process, but it also reinforced our commitment to providing her with the love and stability she deserved, regardless of her biological origins. My father formally adopted her within 6 months of Victoria's sentencing, making legal what had already become emotional reality. Chloe was his daughter in every way that mattered, and our family would protect her from any future attempts to exploit her vulnerability. I completed my master's degree in social work that summer, writing my thesis on financial abuse in wealthy families and the ways that predators used economic manipulation to control and exploit their victims. The research allowed me to transform our family's trauma into knowledge that could help other families recognize and respond to similar threats. Several academic journals expressed interest in publishing my work, and I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about child protection and domestic violence prevention. The decision to become a public advocate for child protection wasn't easy, as it meant continuing to expose our family's private pain to public scrutiny. But the response to my speaking engagements convinced me that our story could serve a larger purpose beyond our personal healing. Dozens of people approached me after each presentation to share their own experiences with financial abuse and manipulation, many describing situations that echoed elements of Victoria's behavior patterns. One particularly impactful conversation occurred after a conference presentation in Denver, where a woman named Patricia approached me with tears in her eyes, and a story that could have been lifted from our own experience. Her wealthy ex-husband's new wife had been systematically poisoning their shared children during custody visits, using the same methods and alibis that Victoria had employed. Patricia's attempts to raise concerns with family court had been dismissed as vindictive ex-wife syndrome, and she'd been losing hope that anyone would take her allegations seriously. Armed with information from my presentation about warning signs and documentation strategies, Patricia was able to build a case that resulted in her ex-husband's wife being arrested and charged with child abuse. The children were removed from the home and placed in protective custody while the investigation proceeded. Patricia's gratitude was overwhelming, but more importantly, her success demonstrated that our family's suffering could prevent other children from experiencing similar abuse. The civil lawsuit against Victoria's estate proceeded separately from the criminal case, allowing our family to recover some of the money she'd stolen, while also establishing legal precedents for future cases involving financial abuse and attempted inheritance fraud. David Chen worked with a team of forensic accountants to trace Victoria's theft through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts, ultimately recovering nearly $2 million that she'd embezzled from family accounts over the course of her marriage to my father. More significant than the financial recovery was the legal precedent the civil case established for holding domestic abusers accountable for the full scope of their crimes. The court ruled that Victoria's systematic abuse of Chloe constituted a form of financial fraud against the family trust, since her actions had been designed to eliminate heirs and manipulate inheritance distributions. The ruling provided important legal tools for other families dealing with similar situations, particularly in cases where criminal convictions might be difficult to obtain. Aunt Helena's decision to write a book about our family's experience surprised everyone, including herself. She'd initially begun keeping detailed notes about the legal proceedings as a way of processing her own trauma and anger, but the writing gradually evolved into something more comprehensive and purposeful. Her background as a family law attorney gave her unique insight into the legal and psychological dynamics of domestic abuse in wealthy families, while her personal involvement in our case provided emotional authenticity that pure academic analysis couldn't achieve. The book, titled Poisoned Trust: A Family's Battle Against Financial Predation, became an unexpected bestseller that sparked national conversations about child protection and domestic violence prevention. Helena donated the proceeds to organizations that supported child abuse victims and domestic violence survivors, transforming our family's pain into resources that could help other families in crisis. The success of the book also led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies and family courts that wanted to improve their response to similar cases. Chloe's 10th birthday celebration marked a significant milestone in our family's recovery, representing 2 full years of safety and healing since Victoria's arrest. We held the party at Cliffside Manor for the first time since Victoria's conviction, reclaiming our family home as a place of joy rather than trauma. Chloe invited her entire class from her new school, along with several children she'd met through her therapy group, creating a celebration that emphasized friendship and community rather than wealth and status. Watching Chloe laugh with genuine delight as she played games with her friends, I was struck by how completely she'd recovered from the trauma that had once seemed insurmountable. The confident, joyful child who emerged from years of systematic abuse was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of unconditional love and support. Her recovery hadn't erased the scars Victoria had left, but it had proven that even the most severe trauma could be overcome with appropriate care and protection. My father's transformation over the 2 years since Victoria's arrest was equally remarkable, though more subtle in its manifestations. The man who'd once been absent for weeks at a time pursuing business opportunities had become fully present in his daughters' lives, prioritizing family relationships over financial growth in ways that would have been unthinkable during his first marriage. His guilt over bringing Victoria into our lives had motivated him to become the kind of father and grandfather he'd never thought he had time to be. The establishment of the Brennan Foundation for Child Protection became my father's primary focus outside of family responsibilities, channeling his business expertise and financial resources into preventing other children from experiencing the kind of abuse Chloe had survived. The foundation funded research into early warning signs of child abuse, provided training for family court personnel and law enforcement officers, and supported advocacy organizations that worked with child abuse victims and their families. My own career path evolved in directions I'd never anticipated, combining my academic training in social work with lived experience that gave me credibility in professional and policy circles. I became a regular consultant for family courts dealing with complex abuse cases, helping judges and attorneys recognize the sophisticated manipulation tactics that predators like Victoria employed. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, providing a way to honor our family's suffering by preventing similar tragedies. The 3-year anniversary of Chloe's poisoning passed quietly, marked by a private family dinner rather than the media attention that had characterized the earlier anniversaries. The date had lost its power to traumatize us, becoming instead a reminder of how far we'd traveled on our journey toward healing and wholeness. Chloe remembered the anniversary but wasn't haunted by it, having integrated the experience into her personal narrative in healthy ways that honored her survival without defining her entire identity. Victoria's appeals process continued for several years, with her attorneys pursuing every possible avenue for overturning her conviction or reducing her sentence. Each appeal was ultimately unsuccessful, with appellate courts consistently ruling that the evidence against her had been overwhelming and that her trial had been conducted fairly and competently. The final appeal was rejected by the California Supreme Court 4 years after her initial conviction, officially ending any possibility that she might someday be released from prison. The news of Victoria's final legal defeat brought a sense of closure that allowed our family to move forward without the lingering anxiety that had accompanied each stage of the appeals process. Chloe, now 13 and entering her teenage years with confidence and optimism, barely acknowledged the news when we told her about it. Victoria had become a historical footnote in her life rather than an ongoing source of fear or trauma, which was exactly how it should be. My relationship with my father deepened significantly during the years following Victoria's conviction, as we worked together on the foundation and shared the experience of advocating for child protection policies. The crisis that had nearly destroyed our family ultimately brought us closer together, creating bonds of trust and mutual respect that had been missing during my childhood and adolescence. He became not just my father but my partner in work, that we both considered more important than any business venture or financial achievement. Helena's continued presence in our lives provided stability and wisdom that helped all of us navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of recovery. Her decision to remain at Cliffside Manor had created a multi-generational household that felt like family in ways that transcended blood relationships or legal obligations. She became the grandmother Chloe had never known and the mother figure I'd been missing since my own mother's death years earlier. The media attention surrounding our case gradually diminished as newer scandals captured public interest, but the impact of our story continued to resonate in professional and policy circles. Changes in family court procedures, enhanced background investigation requirements for domestic employees, and improved training for medical professionals dealing with suspected child abuse cases all trace their origins to lessons learned from Victoria's systematic campaign of abuse and attempted murder. 5 years after Victoria's conviction, I published my own book about our family's experience, focusing on the recovery process and the ways that families could rebuild trust and safety after experiencing severe trauma. Unlike Helena's book, which had emphasized the legal and systemic aspects of our case, my book concentrated on the emotional and psychological journey that survivors of domestic abuse must navigate. The response from readers was overwhelming, with thousands of letters and emails from people who'd found hope and guidance in our story. Chloe entered high school as a confident, articulate young woman who'd chosen to become involved in peer counseling and anti-bullying initiatives at her school. Her experience with Victoria had given her unusual insight into manipulation and abuse tactics, making her particularly effective at helping other students recognize and respond to toxic relationships. Her teachers and counselors consistently commented on her maturity and empathy, qualities that had been forged in trauma but expressed through service to others. The financial impact of Victoria's crimes continued to reverberate years after her conviction, but in positive ways that reflected our family's commitment to transforming suffering into service. The money recovered through the civil lawsuit was donated to child protection organizations, while the ongoing profits from Helena's book and my speaking engagements funded research and advocacy programs. Victoria's attempt to steal our wealth had ultimately resulted in millions of dollars being directed toward preventing similar crimes against other families. My father's relationship with Chloe evolved naturally as she matured, moving from protective guardian to trusted mentor and friend. Their shared experience of surviving Victoria's manipulation created a bond that transcended the typical step-parent-stepchild dynamic, while his adoption of her had provided legal and emotional security that allowed their relationship to develop without external complications. Watching them work together on foundation projects or simply enjoying each other's company during family dinners, it was impossible to imagine that they hadn't been family from the beginning. The house in Malibu where so much trauma had occurred was gradually transformed into a place of healing and celebration, with new memories overlaying the painful associations that had once made every room feel haunted. Chloe's friends were regular visitors, their laughter and energy filling spaces that had once been dominated by Victoria's calculated coldness. The home that had been a prison during Victoria's residency became a sanctuary, where safety and love were taken for granted rather than fought for. As Chloe approached her 16th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the journey our family had traveled since that terrible night when she'd nearly died from chemical poisoning. The scared little girl who'd been systematically abused by her own mother had grown into a strong, compassionate young woman who used her experience to help others facing similar challenges. Her transformation was a testament to the healing power of love, safety, and professional support, but also to her own remarkable resilience and strength. The trust fund that Victoria had tried to claim through murder remained intact and carefully protected, managed by trustees who understood the history behind its creation and the responsibility that came with safeguarding it for future generations. Chloe would inherit her share when she turned 25, but unlike Victoria's calculated approach to our family's wealth, her inheritance would come with the knowledge and values needed to use it responsibly. She'd already expressed interest in expanding the foundation's work and using her resources to protect other children from predators like Victoria. My own future remained bright with possibilities that extended far beyond the financial security that had once seemed like the most important thing in my life. The career I'd built in child protection and family advocacy provided meaning and purpose that no amount of money could purchase, while the relationships I'd developed with other survivors and advocates created a sense of community that wealth alone had never provided. Victoria's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately led me to discover work that felt like a calling rather than simply a profession. The final chapter of Victoria's story was written not in appeals courts or prison cells, but in the lives of the children who were protected because our family had found the courage to speak out against her crimes. Every child who was saved from abuse because a teacher recognized warning signs, every family that escaped a predator because they understood the tactics Victoria had employed, every court decision that prioritized child safety over parental rights represented a victory that transcended any legal verdict or prison sentence. Victoria would spend the rest of her life in prison, forgotten by most of the world, and remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances over evidence. Her carefully constructed image as a devoted mother and loving wife had been permanently destroyed, replaced by the reality of what she truly was, a predator who'd used the most sacred bonds of family to pursue wealth and power. Justice had been served not just through her conviction and imprisonment, but through the transformation of her victims into advocates who would spend their lives protecting other families from similar dangers. 10 years after that first terrifying night in the emergency room, our family had not just survived Victoria's attempt to destroy us. We had thrived in ways that would have been impossible if we'd remained trapped in the web of manipulation and abuse she'd constructed. Chloe was healthy, happy, and whole. My father had become the present, engaged parent he'd never learned to be during my childhood. Helena had found new purpose in writing and advocacy that honored her years of legal experience. And I had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts emerge from the deepest wounds, transforming victims into warriors who can light the way for others struggling in darkness. The trust Victoria had tried to claim through murder remained intact, but it had been joined by something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that our family's bonds were stronger than any predator's scheme, that truth would ultimately triumph over deception, and that love, real, unconditional, protective love was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.